"Don't open that door," she said, her voice barely rising above the low hum of conversation. Yet something in it made the man pause for half a second, just enough for the moment to feel wrong. The kind of wrong that doesn't announce itself, only waits to be noticed. But Daniel Whitmore wasn't a man who paused for waitresses, not in a room like this, not on a night like this, where every second carried the weight of an $800 million decision. The private dining floor shimmered in warm gold light, crystal glasses catching reflections of tailored suits and quiet ambition. The air smelled faintly of oak and expensive wine, and behind it all stood Emily Carter, still as a shadow, her tray balanced effortlessly in one hand, her eyes not on the guests, but on the door, a reinforced steel panel tucked discreetly behind a velvet divider, marked for staff only, though tonight it had been left slightly ajar, just enough for a line of darkness to cut through the polished room. No one else had noticed, no one except her. She had been moving between tables, silent, precise, invisible, until the sound reached her, not loud, not dramatic, just a soft metallic click, followed by a frequency shift so faint it blended into the building's normal rhythm. Except it wasn't normal. She stopped mid-step, her fingers tightening slightly around the tray, her breath slowing instead of quickening. Because panic never helped. Not where she came from. Across the room, Daniel adjusted his cufflinks, barely listening as his partner spoke about projections and timelines, his attention drifting toward the door as one of the investors mentioned a secured access point for the final stage of their deal. "It's through there," someone said casually, gesturing. And just like that, the room's focus shifted, chairs moved, polished shoes turned, and Daniel stood, confident, composed, already calculating the next step. He didn't notice Emily stepping closer, didn't notice the way her posture changed, subtle but deliberate, as if she had crossed an invisible line. "Sir," she said, placing a glass of water gently on the table, her tone professional, controlled, but her eyes never leaving the door. "I wouldn't open that." A few heads turned, mild irritation flickering across faces and used to interruption. Daniel glanced at her then, really looked for the first time, expecting hesitation, maybe nerves, but finding neither, just calm, steady awareness. It annoyed him more than it should have. "And why is that?" he asked, not unkind, but dismissive, already turning back. Emily didn't answer right away, because explanations took time, and time was the one thing they didn't have. Instead, she watched the reflection in the polished metal handle, a faint pulse, out of sync with the building's usual pattern. There it was again, almost invisible, because it's not what it looks like, she said quietly. But Daniel had already stepped forward, his hand reaching for the handle, the room holding its breath without realizing it. And somewhere deep in the walls, something shifted. His fingers brushed the cold metal, and for a fraction of a second, nothing happened, just silence stretching thin across the room. The kind of silence that feels heavier than sound. Then the building responded, not loudly at first, but with a low mechanical hum rising beneath their feet, like something waking up deep inside the walls. Daniel froze, his hand still on the handle, his confident expression flickering into something uncertain. Behind him, the investors exchanged glances, their conversation collapsing into whispers. And then it hit, a sharp electronic tone cutting through the air, followed by another, and another, until the entire floor was filled with the steady pulse of an alarm system activating in layers. Red lights blinked to life along the ceiling, reflections bouncing off glass and polished steel. Security doors began to seal with controlled precision, one after another, not chaotic, not random, but deliberate, as if the building itself had made a decision. Daniel pulled his hand back instinctively, stepping away from the door as it locked with a heavy click, his jaw tightening as he tried to regain control of a situation that had slipped from his grasp in seconds. "What is this?" someone demanded, their voice sharp, edged with unease, but no one answered, not immediately, because no one understood, except one person. Emily had not moved, her tray now resting quietly on the table beside her, her posture steady, her breathing even. While everyone else reacted, she observed, her gaze shifting briefly toward the small black dome camera mounted in the corner of the room, then back to the door, calculating, confirming. The pattern was exactly what she had expected. Not a malfunction, not an accident, but a triggered response. It is a security lockdown, she said finally, her voice calm enough to cut through the noise without rising above it. A few heads turned toward her again, this time without irritation. Triggered by unauthorized access. Daniel looked at her sharply. The irritation gone now, replaced by something more focused, more alert. You seem very sure for someone serving drinks, he said, not accusing, but searching. Emily met his gaze without hesitation. Because that door is not just a door, she replied, then glanced back at it. Briefly, it is tied into the building's internal network. Opening it without clearance signals a breach. A pause, just long enough for the weight of her words to settle. The investors fell silent, their earlier confidence dissolving into careful attention. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair as he looked around the room. The alarms still echoing, the lights still pulsing. Control had shifted, and he knew it. And you knew this how? He asked, quieter now. Emily did not answer immediately, her eyes drifting once more to the camera, then to the faint seam of the door, where the light no longer flickered. The system had completed its cycle. Everything was sealed, contained, because the signal was wrong. She said at last, simple, precise, as if that explained everything. But it did not. Not to them. Not yet. Daniel studied her, really studied her this time. The way she stood, the way she spoke, the absence of hesitation, none of it matched the role she was supposed to be playing. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a realization began to form, quiet, unsettling, that the most important person in the room might not be sitting at the table at all. The alarms did not stop. They settled into a steady rhythm, controlled and intentional, like a system that had already calculated every possible outcome. The flashing red lights reflected in the polished surfaces around them, turning a room built for power into something uncertain, almost exposed. Daniel straightened his posture, forcing his voice back into command. Everyone stay calm, he said. Though the calm he demanded had already shifted towards someone else, security voices crackled faintly through. Hidden speakers, distorted, overlapping, not the usual coordinated tone of a controlled environment. Emily heard it immediately, the slight delay between transmissions, the mismatch in cadence. It was subtle, but it did not belong. She stepped closer to the table, not drawing attention, but not hiding anymore either, her presence now anchored in the room rather than blending into it. That is not your security team, she said quietly, just enough for Daniel to hear. His eyes narrowed. Explain, he replied, the single word carrying more weight than any raised voice. Emily tilted her head slightly, listening, filtering. Your internal system uses a synchronized channel, she said, her gaze drifting briefly toward the ceiling. This one is fragmented, like someone is routing signals through an external source. A pause, just long enough for the implication to settle. One of the investors shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the sealed exits. You are saying we are being what? Intercepted? He asked, the word feeling unfamiliar in a place designed to feel untouchable. Emily did not respond to him. Her focus remained on Daniel, because he was the one who needed to understand. I am saying the system responded correctly, she continued, calm, precise, but not to the right trigger. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, his mind moving faster now, connecting pieces, recalibrating assumptions. So opening that door, he said slowly, was not the mistake. Emily met his gaze. Steady, no, she said. Opening it early would have been. A silence followed, deeper this time, heavier, because it carried realization, not confusion. Daniel looked back at the door, then at the room, then at her. You expected this, he said, not a question. Emily did not deny it, but she did not confirm it directly either. Instead, she reached for the glass she had set down earlier, adjusting it slightly, a small, controlled movement that contrasted sharply with the tension around them. I noticed a pattern, she said, and I waited. Daniel let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when control is no longer absolute, but understanding begins to take its place. You waited for me to open it, he said. Emily shook her head once, almost imperceptibly. I waited for the system to reveal itself, she replied, then glanced again toward the camera, her expression unreadable. Now it has. Across the room, one of the screens flickered faintly, a detail most would miss. But not her, not now. Her eyes shifted instantly, Catching the change, the next phase had already begun, and whatever was happening inside this building, it was no longer hidden, it was unfolding, layer by layer, and for the first time, Daniel Whitmore was no longer the one leading the room. He was following someone he had not even noticed 10 minutes ago. The flicker lasted less than a second, but it was enough, a brief distortion across the polished black screen mounted on the far wall, like a reflection that did not belong. Emily saw it instantly, her eyes narrowing just slightly as she stepped away from the table. No rush, no panic, just a quiet shift in direction. Daniel noticed, of course he did, because now he was watching her instead of the room. "What is it?" he asked, his voice lower, controlled, but no longer dismissive. Emily did not look back at him right away, her attention fixed on the screen as it stabilized, returning to the usual display of company data and projected numbers. Clean, precise, exactly what it was supposed to show, except it was not anymore. "That screen should not be refreshing," she said, her tone almost conversational, but the weight behind it made the words land differently. One of the investors frowned. "It is just a system reset," he offered, more to reassure himself than anyone else. Emily shook her head slightly. "No," she replied. "Your internal displays run on a closed loop during lockdown. No external input, no updates." She paused, then added quietly, "Unless something forced its way in before the lockdown completed." The room shifted again, not physically, but in awareness, the kind that makes every small detail feel suddenly important. Daniel followed her gaze to the screen, then back to her. "You were saying someone accessed the system before it sealed," he said, piecing it together. Emily nodded once. "And they are still inside it," she added. Not dramatically, just as a fact, a truth that did not need emphasis to be understood. The investors exchanged looks, tension building in silence. One of them reached instinctively for his phone, only to glance at the blank signal bars, a subtle reminder that whatever was happening, it was contained, controlled from somewhere they could not reach. Daniel exhaled slowly, his mind adjusting, shifting from reaction to strategy. "Then we isolate it," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "We shut down the system entirely." Emily finally turned to face him fully, and for the first time, there was something almost like resistance in her expression, not defiance, but precision. "If you do that now," she said, "you will lose the only trace of where it came from." Daniel hesitated, just a fraction, but enough to show the shift. 10 minutes ago, he would not have. 10 minutes ago, he would have acted without question. Now he listened. "So what do you suggest?" he asked, the words measured, deliberate. Emily glanced once more at the screen, then at the sealed door, then at the camera, connecting points no one else could see. "We let it continue," she said, calm, steady. "Not long, just enough." The room reacted instantly, discomfort rising. "Let it continue," someone repeated, disbelief clear. Emily did not look at them. Her focus remained on Daniel, because he was the only one whose decision mattered. "It is already inside," she explained. "Stopping it now hides it. Letting it move reveals it." A pause, then softer. "You built this system to protect everything you have." Daniel studied her, searching for hesitation, for uncertainty, finding none, only clarity. "Then trust it," she finished, and in that moment, the alarms, the lights, the sealed doors, none of it felt as unsettling as the quiet realization settling over him, that the person guiding his next move was not on his executive team, not in his boardroom, but standing in front of him, holding nothing but a simple tray and a truth no one else had seen. Daniel did not respond immediately, not because he did not understand, but because he understood too well, the kind of understanding that forces a man to choose between control and trust, and for someone like him, that was never a simple choice. The alarms continued their steady pulse, no longer shocking, now almost rhythmic, like a countdown no one could see. His eyes moved from the screen to Emily, then back again, measuring, calculating. But this time, the calculation was different. It included her. "All right," he said finally, his voice firm, decisive. "We wait." A few sharp breaths echoed around the table, disbelief barely contained. One of the investors leaned forward, his tone urgent. "Daniel, we do not even know what we are dealing with." But Daniel did not look at him. His focus remained fixed on the woman who had seen everything before anyone else. "Neither did we 10 minutes ago," he replied, calm but final. The room fell into a tense silence, not agreement, but acceptance, because when Daniel Whitmore made a decision, people followed, even when they did not understand it. Emily gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, then turned her attention fully to the screen, her posture shifting again, not a server now, not even an observer, but something closer to a specialist returning to a familiar space. The numbers on the display flickered once more, subtle changes. Percentages adjusting by fractions, data streams refreshing in intervals that did not match the system's original design. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning quickly, not reading in the usual sense, but recognizing patterns, movements, intentions hidden inside the code. "It is mapping," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. Daniel moved beside her without hesitation, his presence no longer dominating, but aligning. "Mapping what?" he asked. Emily lifted her gaze slightly, tracking the shifting data. "Your internal architecture," she replied, "learning how everything connects." A pause, then softer. "And where it matters most." Daniel's expression hardened, not with anger, but with focus. "So it is not just inside," he said. "It is studying." Emily nodded once. "Yes," she said. "And it is patient." The word hung in the air, heavier than the alarms, because patience meant intention, and intention meant purpose. One of the investors stepped back slightly, as if distance could create safety. "Can we stop it now?" he asked, the question almost hopeful. Emily did not answer immediately, her eyes narrowing as the screen shifted again, a new layer revealing itself, not obvious, not designed to be seen. But there, hidden beneath the surface, she reached out, not touching the screen, just hovering her hand near it, as if tracing something invisible. "Not yet," she said finally, her voice steady. "It has not reached the end of its path." Daniel followed her gaze, trying to see what she saw, to understand what she understood, but it was not the data that mattered. It was the pattern, the direction, the intent behind it. And for the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar, not fear, not doubt, but the realization that someone else was several steps ahead, and that someone was standing right beside him, wearing a uniform no one had taken seriously. "Where is it going?" he asked, quieter now, almost careful. Emily did not look at him, her eyes fixed on the final shift in the data, the moment when the pattern became clear, when the path revealed its destination, and when it did, she exhaled slowly, not in surprise, but in confirmation. "To you," she said, and the room fell completely silent. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and precise, and for a moment no one moved, not because they did not understand, but because they did. Daniel stood completely still, his expression unreadable, but his mind already racing ahead. If the system was mapping toward him, then it was not random, it was targeted, intentional, designed. "Explain that," he said quietly, his voice controlled but edged with something. Sharper now, Emily shifted her gaze from the screen to him, calm as ever. "It is not looking for data," she said. "It is looking for access." Daniel frowned slightly. "Access to what?" he asked. Emily did not hesitate. "To the one person who can override everything." A silence followed, deeper than before, because this time it was personal. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders tightening just enough to reveal the weight of realization. "Me," he said, not as a question, but as a conclusion. Emily nodded once. "Your credentials are not just authorization," she added. "They are the master key." Across the room, the investors shifted again, their earlier confidence now replaced with a quiet unease. One of them spoke up, his voice lower, cautious. "So if it reaches him." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Emily's eyes flickered briefly back to the screen, tracking the movement, the progression. "Then it does not need anything else," she said. Simple, direct. Daniel ran a hand along his jaw, thinking, recalculating, every instinct telling him to shut it down, to cut the system completely. But her earlier words held him back. Stopping it now would erase the path, erase the source, and leave them blind. "How long?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more focused. Emily studied the shifting data for a moment, then answered. "Not long," she said. It is close. The room tightened again. Tension building not from noise, but from anticipation. Daniel glanced at the camera in the corner, then at the sealed door, then back to Emily. And when it gets there, he asked. Emily stepped slightly closer to him, not invading space, but aligning. That depends, she said. Daniel's eyes narrowed. On what? He pressed. Emily met his gaze fully, steady, unflinching. On whether you act like every other system it has seen, she said. A pause, then softer. Or something it cannot predict. Daniel held her gaze, searching for the meaning behind the words, and slowly, it began to form, not in the data, not in the alarms, but in the pattern of behavior. Systems followed rules, people followed habits, and anything predictable could be exploited. So it expects me to respond, he said, thinking aloud now. Emily nodded. Yes, she said. It is waiting for you to do what you always do. Daniel let out a quiet breath, the tension in his posture shifting into something more deliberate, more controlled. Then we do not give it that, he said, not loudly, not dramatically, just a decision. Emily's expression did not change, but there was a subtle acknowledgement in her eyes. No, she replied. We do not. The screen flickered again, the data tightening, converging, the path nearly complete. And for the first time since the alarms began, Daniel did not look at the system. He looked at her, because somehow, without ever asking for it, she had become the one guiding what came next. The room did not feel the same anymore, not because anything had changed physically, but because the center of control had shifted in a way no one could ignore. Daniel stood still for a moment longer, then did something no one in that room had ever seen him do. He stepped back, just half a step, subtle, almost invisible, but intentional. His hands moved away from his watch, from his phone, from anything that could be recognized as access, as authority, as control, and in that small movement, the pattern began to break. Emily noticed immediately, her eyes flickering to the screen where the data tightened again, then hesitated, just slightly, a fraction of a delay that had not been there before. It is adjusting, she said quietly, her voice calm but precise. Daniel did not look at the screen. He kept his gaze on her, trusting the shift. Good, he replied, his tone steady. Across the room, one of the investors whispered, "What is happening now?" But no one answered him, because the answer was unfolding in silence. The system had expected a response, a command, a signal, but it found none. Instead, it found absence, a void where a predictable action should have been, and for the first time, it slowed, not stopped, but slowed. Emily stepped closer to the screen, her attention fully locked on the changing pattern. It cannot complete the path, she said, more certain now. It needs confirmation. Daniel exhaled slowly, understanding deepening. And I am not giving it. That, he said. Emily nodded once. Exactly, she replied. The alarms continued, but now they felt distant, secondary, as if the real conflict had moved somewhere deeper, into the unseen logic of the system itself. The screen flickered again, the mapping lines shifting direction, searching, recalculating, like a question being asked over and over without an answer. One of the sealed doors released a faint mechanical click, not opening, just adjusting pressure, a subtle sign that something inside the system had changed course. Daniel finally glanced at the display, not to control it, but to observe it, to witness what happened when he did nothing. It is looking for another way, he said. Emily did not deny it. Yes, she said, because it was built to succeed. A pause, then softer. Just like you. Daniel almost smiled at that, not out of amusement, but recognition. The parallel was not lost on him. Then it will not stop, he said. Emily's eyes remained on the screen, her expression focused. No, she agreed. But it will reveal itself trying. The data shifted again, faster now, less precise, small inconsistencies appearing where there had been none before, and Emily saw it. The flaw, the trace, the one detail that did not belong. Her hand lifted slightly, pointing not at the center of the screen, but at the edge, where a faint signal repeated in a pattern too rigid to be natural. There, she said, her voice low but certain. Daniel followed her indication, narrowing his eyes. That is it, he asked. Emily nodded. That is where it entered, she said, then looked at him, not as a server, not as an outsider, but as someone standing on equal ground. Now you can stop it. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had just happened. Daniel looked back at the screen, then at his own hands, then at her, and in that moment, he understood something far more valuable than control. He understood timing, and for once, he waited until the exact right moment to act. Daniel did not rush, not this time. His hand remained still for one final second as his eyes locked onto the faint signal Emily had pointed out, the pattern repeating at the edge of the system like a quiet signature left behind by something that thought it would never be seen. The alarms continued, but they no longer felt urgent. They felt like background noise to a much more precise moment. His fingers moved then, not toward his phone, not toward the obvious controls, but toward the inner panel on his watch, a feature very few people in the room even knew existed. A direct line to the system's highest level override, but he did not activate it immediately. He adjusted his stance slightly, aligning his body just enough so that his reflection would not be clearly captured by the camera in the corner. Emily noticed, of course she did, a small detail, but an important one, because predictability was no longer an option. Now, she said quietly, not as an order, but as a recognition of timing. Daniel tapped once, a single, deliberate motion. The system responded instantly, but not loudly. The alarms did not spike. The lights did not flare. Instead, something far more subtle happened. The flickering on the screen stopped. The pattern froze, held in place as if time itself had paused within the code. Then, line by line, the unauthorized signal began to isolate, separating itself from the rest of the system like ink being pulled from water, clean, precise, controlled. The investors watched without speaking, their earlier tension replaced by something closer to awe, because what they were witnessing was not chaos being stopped, it was chaos being understood. Emily stepped closer to the screen, her eyes tracking the extraction, confirming, verifying every movement exactly where it should be. "You caught it before it could reroute," she said, her voice calm, but carrying a note of quiet approval. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. "Because you showed me where to look," he replied, and for a moment, there was no hierarchy in his tone, no distance, just acknowledgement. The screen shifted again, the isolated signal now contained within a single segment, no longer moving, no longer learning, just there, exposed. One of the investors finally spoke, his voice lower, almost careful. "So it is over?" Emily did not answer. Right away, her gaze still fixed on the contained signal, studying it, not for danger, but for meaning. "It is stopped," she said after a moment, then added softly, "but not over." Daniel followed her gaze, understanding immediately. Stopping something was not the same as understanding who had sent it, or why. And those questions mattered more than anything that had just happened. He turned slightly, looking at the sealed door, then at the camera, then back at her. "You knew there would be more," he said. Emily met his eyes, steady as ever. "There is always more," she replied. The system around them began to normalize, the alarms fading, the red lights dimming back into warm gold, the doors unlocking one by one with quiet precision, as if nothing had happened at all. But everything had. The room breathed again, conversations beginning in low, uncertain tones, yet Daniel did not move. He remained where he was, looking at the woman who had seen everything before it began, and in that moment, he realized something he had never considered before. That power was not always the one who acted first. Sometimes, it was the one who saw first and waited. The room slowly returned to what it had been, but not quite. The lights softened, the alarms faded into silence, and the doors unlocked with quiet precision. Yet something invisible had shifted, something that could not be reset by a system or explained by a report. Daniel stood there for a moment longer, watching the last trace of the isolated signal on the screen, now contained, harmless, but still present. Like a question waiting to be answered, the investors began speaking again in low voices, trying to reclaim the confidence they had lost. But their words felt different now, less certain, more aware. Daniel did not join them. Instead, he turned his attention to Emily, who had already stepped back from the screen, her posture returning to something closer to what it had been before, calm, composed, almost invisible again, as if the last 10 minutes had not changed her at all. but it had changed everything else. You knew, he said quietly, not as an accusation, but as a realization. Emily picked up her tray, adjusting it lightly in her hands, her expression neutral. I noticed, she replied. Simple, precise. Daniel took a step closer, not imposing, but intentional. That is not the same thing, he said, his voice lower now, more thoughtful than commanding. Emily met his gaze, steady as always. It is, if you pay attention long enough, she answered. A brief silence followed, not uncomfortable, but full. Daniel studied her. The way she spoke, the way she held herself, the absence of any need to prove anything. And for the first time, he saw her clearly, not as a waitress, not as background, but as someone who had chosen to remain unseen. You do not belong here, he said, not dismissive, but certain. Emily tilted her head slightly, a faint hint of something almost like a smile touching her expression. Everyone belongs somewhere, she replied, then added softly. Just not always where people expect. Daniel let out a quiet breath, a sound closer to acknowledgement than argument. Behind them, the system fully reset, the screen returning to its original display, clean, controlled, as if the intrusion had never happened. But Daniel knew better. He glanced at the contained signal one last time before it disappeared completely. Archived, stored, waiting for someone to follow it back to its source. I will need to know everything you saw, he said, turning back to her, his tone measured, professional again, but not distant. Emily adjusted her grip on the tray, her eyes drifting briefly toward the door. Now just a door again, harmless, ordinary. You will, she said, then stepped back slightly, the distance returning, not as a barrier, but as a choice. Daniel watched her, something unspoken settling between them, respect, not demanded, not given lightly, but earned in silence. She turned then, moving away with the same quiet efficiency she had arrived with, blending once more into the rhythm of the room, unnoticed by most, but not by him, not anymore. And as Daniel stood there, surrounded by wealth, by influence, by everything he had built, he understood something that had never appeared in any report or projection, that the most dangerous thing in any system was not the breach, not the code, not even the unknown. It was the moment someone underestimated the quiet person standing right in front of them, because sometimes the ones who say the least are the ones who see the most, and they do not need to raise their voice to change everything.